Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of our Henry Jenkins lecture. So, this is where we left off, and this is the point in the essay where Jenkins begins discussing fan fiction and fan writing. And so he describes a series of different outlets or platforms that people used to use, and I suppose some still do, but now most of this is on the internet, of course. But it used to be that fans would create what were called zines. And zines were a lot like magazines, but instead of being published by a major publisher like Condé Nast or some big corporation like that, these zines would be produced by the authors or by editors, by regular people, and then distributed through the mail or circulate by word of mouth or passed from one fan to another. And he talks about some of the different kinds of zines that existed. And so there were letter zines, which contained short articles and letters from fans on issues surrounding their favorite shows. Fiction zines, where fans would write their own fan fiction, poems, and even sometimes novels that contained the characters and settings and concepts from the shows that they really enjoyed. And some of these fan novels, over time, became so popular that they were canonized by fans. In other words, with Star Trek, for example, there were some Star Trek novels, fan-written novels, that became so popular that they just sort of became accepted as part of the story, the backstory, or the part of the overall narrative of the show, or rather of the universe, right, of the fictional universe. But still, it's important to distinguish these from the commercially produced and approved works. These are works that were being written by fans without the permission of the program's creators. And so as a result, they're totally unauthorized, right? And they face the constant threat of legal action for their violation of the producer's copyright authority over the show's characters and concepts. So, this puts the producers of the programs and so on in a strange spot, right? Because people love their stuff so much that they've co-opted it, right? They've adopted the characters and written their own stories or written their own scripts or what have you. And obviously they're big fans, but at the same time, there's potential for the fans to write about these characters in ways that the show's creators and producers wouldn't approve of. So as a result, some producers are okay with this, but others not so much. And one example of a corporation not being happy with fan fiction is Lucasfilm. So we have this quote, right? Lucasfilm is saying, "You must enjoy the characters of the Star Wars universe for male reasons. Your sexuality must be correct and proper by my, in parentheses, male definition. I am not male. I do not want to be. I refuse to be a poor imitation or worse, someone's idiotic ideal of femininity. Lucasfilm has said, in essence, this is what we see in the Star Wars films, and we are telling you that this is what you will see." So this is clearly a female fan reacting to Lucasfilm cracking down on people's use of the characters in unauthorized ways because of LGBTQ content, they viewed as detrimental to the brand, right? What the fans argue, though, right, is that they have a right to revise the characters from their favorite shows or texts, to draw elements from this dominant cultural artifact and things from the dominant culture, to produce new meanings, underground art that challenges the assumptions inherent in the original texts. So in other words, what you have here is a community, a subculture, coming to a mainstream, popular culture, in quotation marks, popular culture text, and appropriating, poaching the characters and so on, and re-implementing them in ways that they find more valuable or more edifying, and make them more important to them, right? And make them more enjoyable. And obviously, then there's a tension here that exists oftentimes between producers and fans. So one interesting thing, that Jenkins observes is that fan fiction is almost exclusively a feminine response to mass media texts. And he asks why. And he suggests maybe there are differences in how we read. So there's this quote: "Women enter the world of the novel, take it as something there for that purpose, whereas men see the novel as a result of someone's action and construe its meanings or logic in those terms." So this suggests that the practice of fan writing, the desire to expand speculations about characters and story events beyond textual boundaries, draws heavily upon the types of interpretive strategies more common to the feminine than the masculine. So, the idea here is that, women, according to Jenkins and his theory here, is that women come to the text as something that can be repurposed, right? Is something that in some way is there to be interpreted more openly. And along these same lines, what we see is that, according to Jenkins, men look at the text as more of a closed text, as something that was created by someone and isn't to be played with in the same kind of way. And in essence, not open to the same kind of interpretations. And so this is kind of an interesting insight into the way that men and women engage with texts. So he tells us too, another reason fan writing is a predominantly female activity may have to do with the fact that female characters often only exist in the margins of male-centered narratives. So, clearly, particularly now, if you go back and you look at things like Star Trek, which was on television in the 1960s and rerun throughout the 70s, what you see in this is that it is a predominantly male cast, and that the adventures that the cast are involved with, the characters are involved with in the show, are traditionally led by the men, and so on. And so the female characters in these programs, particularly during these decades, were relegated to sort of marginal roles. And so the idea then is that these texts written by and for men are pleasurable for male readers, but they might resist feminine pleasure. And so to fully enjoy the text, women are forced to perform a type of intellectual transvesticism, right? Identifying with male characters in opposition to their own experiences, or construct unwritten countertext through their daydreams or through their oral interactions with other women that allow them to explore their own narrative concerns. So the idea here is, if you're watching the show, as Jenkins posits it, if you're watching the show as a woman, you're sort of forced to try and identify with the male character, the male leads, who are leading the vast majority of these adventures, whereas the women are marginalized. And so to get this kind of identification, the women turn to fan fiction to improve the roles of the characters, give them a more central spot in the narrative, in the plot, and have them as leaders as well. So he goes on here. He says, just as women's gossip about soap operas assumes a place within a pre-existing feminine oral culture, fan writing adopts forms and function traditional to women's literary culture. And then he goes back and he looks at the history of women's literary culture, and he talks about diaries and letters and journals, about this famous Hawthorne quote where he describes women as damn scribblers, always writing. And he says, much of what they wrote about were things that they could share amongst one another that were socially prohibited kind of speech. So gender roles, sexuality, prostitution, seduction, intemperance, unwanted pregnancies, the desire for further education, and so on. And so, what happens then is that Jenkins draws a kind of line from this history of women sharing oral and written communication to the practice of fan writing, which he sees, circulated by mail. Is the marketing's done by word of mouth. There's a collective construction of alternative realities. There's a very confessional tone. I mean, he's drawing parallels, right? He's drawing parallels between fan fiction and the functions and the traditions served by women's literary culture in the past. And he says this, in a way, is a new iteration of it, and it bears so many of the same characteristics that in some sense it's not surprising that fan fiction is dominated by female writers and female voices. So then he asked the question, why would female fans, as writers, choose to rewrite science fiction and other traditionally masculine genres? So we see this being done with cop shows, with westerns, etc. And he observes that, there are other more feminine, quote-unquote, genres that might not need rewriting. But then he says, well, Star Trek's appeal to professional women, in some sense, involves a promise unfulfilled. So what we see is competent, brave, smart women in sort of these secondary roles that never ascend to the primary roles. And in some sense, they identify with this, given the history of women's struggle in the workplace, struggle for equality, and so on. And so in some sense, he says, we can look at the predominantly female practice of fan fiction as an attempt to kind of repair the damage, right, that's been done to these programs' female characters, and by extension, the damage that many of the authors might feel have been done to them as well, given the patriarchal nature of society 40, 50 years ago, right? And so he gives us a quote from one of the editors of a fanzine, and it says, we hope to raise and explore those questions which network censors, the TV genre, and the prevailing norms of the time made it difficult to address. We believe that both the nature of human interaction and sexual mores will have changed by the 23rd century, and we are interested in pursuing those changes. And of course, Star Trek, I don't know how many of you have watched it. It's getting pretty old at this point, the original series at least. Star Trek dealt with a kind of, in some sense, utopian future. It was an egalitarian future. It was, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, famously spoke a lot about how the series represented a kind of, I'm hesitant to call it a utopia because there were like battles in every episode and fighting and so on. But it definitely had a progressive vision, let's say, of the future. And so it makes sense that fans would take this and then incorporate their own desires into this kind of progressive vision of the future and adapt it according to their own desires, right? So one of the things that Jenkins observes about this fan fiction is that a lot of it borrows its format from more traditionally feminine forms of mass culture. So what we see is it has a serial format, like a soap opera, meaning that the stories go on for a prolonged period of time, each being linked to the next. There is regularly a postponing of resolution, a postponing of closure to the narratives. In other words, they're open-ended. There's not a clear end. At the same time, we also see a series of digressions to introduce events that must have occurred prior to the start of fan stories or to resolve secondary plot lines. So what happens then is that these authors are creating a kind of story tree, right? A non-linear plot with a lot of unresolved situations and deeper explorations of the actions of the secondary characters of the show. And the plots themselves, the narrative thrust, is centered on experience rather than goals, right? It's not about solving problems as much as it is the interaction and the actual, I hate to say it this way, but the phenomenological experience of the characters, right? I realize that's a little philosophical, but in other words, it's about their lived environment, right, and their social relations more than it is about solving ultimately a goal. So again, there's an emphasis on character relations, and Jenkins says, well, this again sort of relates to this dichotomy that he sees between the way that men and women apply interpretive strategies to media. He says men want physical problems and solutions, but women want psychologically based drama. And so, again, I don't know. It would be interesting to hear Jenkins, talk about this again, given that he wrote this decades ago, and see if he would reformulate some of these ideas about the reading strategies of men and women. But nevertheless, this is how he presents it for the time. And so he views a lot of this fan fiction then as what he calls feminine countertexts. They exist on the margins of the original episodes. They refocus the series around traditional feminine contemporary feminist concerns. There is much more emphasis on sexuality and gender politics, religion, family, marriage, and romance, right? And he says what he often sees in these stories is that the authors sort of insert glorified versions of themselves in the stories. there are what he calls the Lieutenant Mary Sue stories. And he says this is when fans create groupie fantasies that reframe the story as a traditional romance. So in these things, the authors would put a sort of a thinly veiled version of themselves in the story, having a relationship, let's say, with Dr. Spock or with Kirk, right? And there's a lot of interest in these stories, specifically in Dr. Spock, who is a half human, half Vulcan. And of course, the Vulcans operate entirely on logic, which is kind of a trope when it comes to men in relationships, right? And so he emphasizes this aspect of it where there's an intense sensuality that the women see in Spock that suggests a kind of hidden sexuality. In other words, they want to see past this kind of logical, cold exterior and see him as a sensual character. And then there's this whole idea of the alienness of Vulcan culture as a metaphor for the factors that prevent intimacy between men and women. Again, this idea that men are overly rational, for example, in relationships is a sort of hurdle to an edifying union. So he goes on and says that frequently the fictional formulas of popular romance are tempered by the women's common social experiences, lovers, wives, and mothers under patriarchy. So, for example, we see these stories with Nurse Chapel, who was involved at one point in a relationship with Spock, according to this one particular popular fan fiction series. And he observes that Nurse Chapel has to overcome feelings of abandonment when Spock gets absorbed in his work. And of course, with some male fans, they denigrate these forms of fan fiction as soap operas with Kirk and Spock. Nevertheless, the female viewers view themselves as constructing soap operas with a difference. Soap operas that reflect their vision, a feminist vision. And most tellingly, view it as a kind of literature of reform. In other words, they're making the stories better. It's not a revolt. It's not a rejection of the stories. It's rewriting the stories to make them better, right, in their eyes. So this brings us again to the issue of moral economy. And what Jenkins finds here, what he's talking about with moral economy, is that there's a very distinct set of rules that are followed by this subgroup of fan fiction writers and fans generally, right? So he says, fans, like any other interpretive community, generate their own norms that work to ensure a reasonable degree of conformity between reading of the primary text. So, even though people are rewriting these stories, even though they're imagining them in different ways, right? There's this idea that there are some rules that have to be respected, including some of the rules that the creators put in place. So even as they wish to rework the program materials to better satisfy their personal interests, there's still this notion that there are some parts of the story, some parts of the series, elements, character elements, and so on, that can't be played with, right? That you have to still be loyal to. And so this whole idea is that there's a moral economy going on here, and the term moral economy comes from E.P. Thompson, who used it to describe 18th century peasant leaders and how they used traditional rights and customs as well as popular consensus to legitimate their efforts to destabilize landowners and property holders. So what you have here is this odd combination, right, of a certain respect for the original text along with a strong desire to change that text. And so it creates this very complicated relationship in terms of what's allowed and what isn't allowed within the moral economy of fandom itself. And this varies from fandom to fandom, right? I mean, what's acceptable when it comes to Star Trek might be different if you're dealing with something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? Or I don't know. I'm not that familiar with contemporary fan fiction, so I'm not sure what people are writing about today. But, 10 years ago, it was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So, what happens then, he tells us, is that fans respect the original text, but fear that their conceptions of the characters and concepts may be jeopardized by those who wish to exploit them for easy profits. So, fans for a long time struggled to keep Star Trek alive, both on TV and in the movies, in the face of network indifference and studio incompetence. They favor the original works of Roddenberry and the writers of the show and his original writers, his original crew, over some of the later stuff. And there's a constant debate amongst fans about what's a legitimate reworking of the material when somebody does rewrite a story, be it fan fiction or even one of the more recent movies. There's a question about whether or not the fans view this as legitimate. And this is all tied to the importance of canon. And canon, in terms of a fandom or a popular series, the whole idea of canon is there are some stories that are included, and there are some stories that aren't. And the stories that are included always, as part of the mythology of this world building, that's the canon. And the stuff outside of that, it really isn't that important. So what you see sometimes, of course, is this is common in comic books as well, right? Where people follow comic books and there'll be a spin-off series or something will happen in an episode or in an issue, but then later they'll pretend as if that never happened. Well, that isn't canon, right? Those things aren't canon. So canon is sort of the legitimate quote-unquote story. So this brings us to Kirk-Spock stories, which Jenkins talks about, and these are generally stories that posit a homoerotic relationship between Kirk and Spock. Now, unsurprisingly, these kinds of stories have met with opposition from traditional fans. Kirk in the original series is a very macho kind of guy, so there's this big question about whether or not having a gay relationship between Kirk and Spock violates the moral economy of fandom. But Jenkins shows us, all fan writing involves an appropriation of series characters and a reworking of program concepts, right? And this is done in order to have the text respond to the fan's own social agenda and interpretive strategies. So Jenkins argues, no, there's nothing wrong with this. There's no difference between what's happening here and in the more soap opera style stories that we discussed earlier, right? This is just another form of adapting the characters and the stories in ways that serve the fans' social agenda and interpretive strategies of reading. All right, so that brings us to the conclusion. So what's important from what we just looked at? So the first thing is that the fans are poachers, right? But they're reluctant poachers. They're poachers who steal only those things that they truly love, who seize televisual property to protect it against abuse. And this abuse can come from the creators, right, the people who created it. And it can certainly come from the people who have ownership over it. So this is one of the things we've seen, for example, with Star Wars, when Disney bought it from Lucasfilm, right? And there was a big uproar amongst fans about whether or not they'd ruin it. We see that female fans claim the work and make it into women's culture, right? They change it from a space opera into a feminist romance. And in this way, what happens is that their consumption of the series becomes an act of production. Reading becomes writing, and spectator culture becomes participatory culture. And of course, here you see, the influence of Fisk, right? These aren't just active audiences in the sense that they're watching the show and making meaning out of it. These are active audiences who watch the show, make meaning out of it, and then make their own stories out of it, right? So this is a really extreme example of the Fiskian kind of ideal, right? And here, again, he takes Fisk a step further with this last point, where he says fans are not empowered by mass culture. Fans are empowered over mass culture. Now, of course, Fisk tells us that we make things popular, right? That we make popular culture, again, which is the opposite of what Adorno and Horkheimer said. They say, we make popular culture. But he's saying, he's taking it a step further in a sense, right? It isn't that it empowers us. It isn't that we find something to like. It's that we actually have power over mass culture. And that indeed part of that power comes in the form of resistance. And resistance comes from the uses that these fans make of these popular texts, from what they add to them, from what they do with them, right? Not from the subversive meanings that are somehow embedded in the text, right? The message of the text, they correct, right? So if we go back to Hall and the notion of the three different reading strategies, right? I mean, you could say that many of these fans have negotiated readings, right? Or maybe even at times they reject the dominant ideology completely that's being portrayed in an episode, but they take measures to overcome that and alter it and change it, right? And this resistance is in the form of creating their own stories with these characters that serve their own needs and interpretive reading strategies. Okay, I hope that made sense, and I appreciate you checking out my videos this week. Thanks.